Okay, so here we are at the second of the four lessons in the foundation month, month 00. Um, and um, in this lesson, we're going to continue our looking at um, the two kinds of learning and the standard from second grade on, the memorizing information and then having to recall the memorized information as the test for learning, as opposed to emergence where um, you actually simply learn to recognize visual patterns, visual things, and the recalling is more a rediscovery than it is a recalling, really. It's rediscovery. Something jars your curiosity, or a question from someone says, what about such? And as your brain pictures this event or thing or something, you walk into the scene in your mind, similar to the way that you're you can be immersed in a movie scene and forget you're watching a movie. It can be as if you're living it. And so everything in learning and emergence is something that's alive. And you can usually tell the difference between recalling memorized information and rediscovering visual information, um, because the recalling the memorized information is usually flat, and the um, the rediscovering the information, um, there's a life to it. There's a story to it. There's something more than just some kind of I don't know, committing it, forcing it into your head for some time. So to see what this is like, we're going to begin to work on you reclaiming your ability to learn as a young child, which is from when you were born through about little, maybe 3.5 or 4 years old, wherein you learn from picture books and you learn from seeing things in life and moving them around and seeing what they do. You learn visually. For most of that time, you didn't have much language, and even when you began to say words, they were sounds. You didn't know what a word was. You didn't read it yet. You were still, it was still a visual thing. So in this lesson, what we're going to use to explore this further is something that would come from that time in your life, which is we're going to look at the life history of the letter A. Where did it come from? Um, Now, I'm going to tell you some things that um, you'll learn over time, but I want you to keep in mind you're not supposed to be trying to memorize anything I'm saying. Nothing. Just let your body hear the words and lead you to these pictures, because the work in each of these lessons is visual. Okay. So there's a concept that defines that in emergence, and it's a way of describing the learning: visual first, conceptual second. Visual first, conceptual second. That means that the first thing that you learn is the visual material, not words, not symbols, in a sense of having a meaning yet, just what things look like. So, in this little life history of the letter A, um, we are going to look at a sequence of five um, pages from the history of the letter A, five points at which it changed significantly um, to become the letter we know today. So, what are you going to be doing? Well, I'm going to once again ask you, don't focus on the words, don't focus on any words. I want you to focus entirely on the pictures, but I want you to notice how, if there's some kind of pressure in your mind about reading the words or about remembering any words, or is there any pressure to memorize anything? to like commit to memory what something looks like. If you have that, which is normal, please do your best to just notice it and let it go, and then, gently refocus your mind on what you're looking at. So, what will you be looking for in the drawings? Well, you're going to be looking at things that are symbols. The letter A is a symbol, but it doesn't start out life like that. You're going to look at the positions of things, how that changes, shapes and lines. Basically, that is it, and eventually, what meaning is assigned to this thing. So, now, the other thing is that I'm also going to, similar to the last talk, I'm going to start with a single little drawing, and in this drawing it'll be the first appearance of something that will become the letter A. It is not a letter A. It's not a letter. It's not even a symbol. It's a little drawing. But I'm going to wait until we pull up that slide before I begin to tell you the story. But with one more thing. I want you to focus on the picture. Then I want you to look at the map that's below that picture, and I want you to find the number on the map that's associated with the number of the drawing. So the first drawing is number 1, and then there'll be a number 1 on the map, and that's where it originated. So you're going to be going through that as the letter A comes into being. It moves around. It changes places. It changes what it is, but it changes places. So this is the kind of the little life history of the letter A. And so here we go. So in the first of these letter A drawings, you see there's some words there. I'm trying to ask you, please do your best. If you feel the urges to look, refocus on the drawing and look at the little drawing which is in that gray area of that kind of drawing in the middle of the thing with the red bar on it, and just look at the shape. Kind of look at the shape and try and see if that resembles something you know. Look at the shape. Now, that shape is supposed to be the head of an ox or a cow with horns, some animal like that. And if you look at the map, number 1 on the map, you see that it originated in a city called Ugarit. I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but I'm doing the best I can here. And it's at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. And so where did that come from? Well, the accountants of the day used to record oxen or cows that were bought and sold, cattle, with a little drawing of a head. And so every cow that was bought or sold, you put a little drawing of a head with horns on the clay tablet, and you scratched it into the still somewhat wet clay tablet with a pointy stick. Okay. So if you sold 5 cows, you had 5 little cow heads that went on your recording of who bought or who sold those cows. Now, it doesn't look like a letter at all, does it? And really, this is very important because that little drawing is a step. It is a way that it's a step away from having a photograph. They couldn't have had that, or a lifelike painting, and they wouldn't have had that. They drew these little heads of oxen with the horns on the clay tablet, and now the drawing represented a real life object. The little head represented a real life object. That's very important as we go through this. So hopefully at this point we can move to the next one. And now here comes the slide. Okay, so this is the second slide in the series of the 5 pages in the history of the letter A, and now you can see that middle bar, that middle gray and red area. There are now 2 drawings there. This is very important. Like the way that you looked at the character type babies in the last lesson, where the first one was by itself, and then the second slide showed a character type 1 next to character type 2, and I asked you to contrast and compare. The same thing, I'm going to ask you to do the same thing here. So in this, you see that the second step in this letter A coming into the world is if you look over at the map, you see that the number 2, and there's a number 2 on the map, and it says Phoenicia. So this is the Phoenician version. So what does that mean? Well, I'm told that that name is a made-up name in modern times, and that they don't know the name of that area. But Ugarit was part of Phoenicia. We're going by this map. And so that one city, the accountants in the neighboring towns or whatever, those accountants went, oh wow, that's a cool way to do this. And as they began to do this, they also began to simplify, in a sense, the drawing of the head of an ox. And if you can look at those 2 little symbols, they're now symbols, you can see that with a little imagination, you can see they kept the line and they kept the horns, the 2 horns, and that's basically what is there. And it still refers, the symbol now refers to a real life object. In the step before this, the first one, a kind of drawing represented the real life object. But now that drawing has become a symbol. So in a sense, the symbol now represents the drawing, which represents a real world object, the ox. Wow. That's a lot. And you do not need to remember this. You just look at this and see what's the same and what's different in those 2 drawings. And you can see how it would have moved over time, long time, and how it would have expanded out, and a whole bunch of accountants in that whole area would have been doing this. Right. All right, so now let's move on to the 3rd step. And the 3rd step in the life history of the letter A, now you can see, similar to the last lesson with the how many character type babies I revealed at a time, again there are 2. But this time it's the second one, and then the 3rd one. Well, why? Contrasting and comparing the shapes, the positions, the orientation, etc. Try to see how the 3rd one came from the second one. I think it was a little easier to see how the second one came from the first one. They look like horns. But try and see how the 3rd one came from the second one. Now, what is this? Well, this has its spread to the Greeks. And so the Greeks, being the Greeks, right, and they're famous for an awful lot of stuff, but part of the things that they're famous for, they borrowed from other people. And then they put a spin on it, and then they said, we invented this. It's Greek. Well, okay, so they took those Phoenician cow horn symbols, right, and then they changed just enough to say that they could say, we invented this. Now, the word in Phoenician for the ox, best that I don't know how to pronounce it, is aleph. And the Greeks, being the Greeks, they just twist it enough so that it's still recognizable, but they now make it alpha. Oh, okay. So, does alpha refer to an ox? No, not at all. Does aleph refer to an ox? Yes. Aleph is the name for ox. And so those symbols in that second one, they not only represent, or they're an evolution from a drawing of an ox head, they also represent they were connected to the word aleph. Okay, but basically the symbol represents a cow or an ox, sold or bought. Moving over to the Greek thing, there's no longer an association between those symbols, any of them, and a real world object. That's fallen by the wayside. It doesn't refer to an ox. What does it refer to? Well, instead of being a real world object, it now refers to a sound. Ah. Where did that come from? It comes from the beginning of the word alpha, and the symbol is now connected to a sound. Now think about what a huge leap this is. Oh my! If you can represent enough sounds, then you can look at a page and you can hear the sounds spoken with enough imagination and, and learning to recognize the shape of the symbol. So a real life ox is then the ox head is drawn, that's the first, and then the symbol that represents the ox's head, just a symbol, it has the name of the ox, aleph, and then the next step, the third step, the Greeks take this and they do a little twisty magic, and now this is the Greek first letter of their alphabet, alphabito. So, can you see how many changes are there represented by just a few strokes of a pointy stick? Or in case something with ink on it or whatever it is, right? But enormous amount of evolution from the first to the third. Now let's look at the fourth one. In the fourth step, the fourth page out of the history of the A, first of all, look at the number 4. It says Etruscan. Okay, now look over on the map and look at the number 4. And something that is curious to some people is if you look at the sequence of numbers on the map, 1, 2, 3, and the 5 looks like it comes next and then the 4. But that's not so. It's in an order, and it really is in that order. So why is the 4 look like it's at the end of the line? Well, because if you trace the numbers over land and you don't go out into the sea, 1, 2, and then moving from 3 to 4, you can get there by land. Now, did any boats go this way? Yes, but when they used boats in that time, they had to, because of their limitations, the boat had to stay in sight of land the whole way. And so going from 3 to 4 means the ship sails around that length of Greece and up into what today is northern Italy, but one was then a Greek colony. Now over time, that Greek colony evolved this, their Greek culture into their own culture called Etruscan. And there's not much left. We don't know a lot about it. Because the final step, which we'll talk about in a minute, the Romans, they destroyed almost all of the culture, the writings and so on of the Etruscans. They tried to erase it as if it never happened. Some years ago, I was in a museum in Milan, in Italy, and there was a wonderful museum of Etruscan findings. It wasn't very large at all, but it was so interesting because in many ways it seemed so alien, the art and the vases and so on. It seemed that way because it's not a forward-moving part in history. Even though its part in the letter A is there, we don't know a lot. What do we know? Well, we know that they had an A, and you can see this in the drawing. And now compare it to the A's that are in the Greek variety. They kept the name of the letter, not the name of a real-life object, the name of the letter and the name for that sound. Those are both in those two symbols in the Etruscan version of the A. And you can also see that more or less the symbol is very much the same. The first A is a little bit curvy, but that's not in the Greek version. But nonetheless, you can see how it moved from number 3 to number 4, from the Greeks to the Etruscans. So, now can you imagine what number 5 looks like before I reveal it? Try and picture it in your head. You'll probably be right. Your picture. Okay, so what is the last step in this? The last step is the Roman version. And so we see this last pairing, and you can see that it's recognizable when you move from 4 to 5, from Etruscan to Roman. You can see this visually. Imagine how many words I would have to say to describe the A symbols in number 4 as opposed to the A symbol in number 5. And then contrast and compare that to you looking at the two right now. And how easy is it for you to see the difference? This is important. Everything in emergence rests on that difference, of how easy it is to see difference and sameness, and yet how difficult it can be to put those things into words. Which is why visual first, conceptual second learning is superior, and the basis of everything in emergence. I only wish I knew this all the years that I've been trying to teach emergence, because I have been missing it. I've been doing it. I've been making discoveries like this, but until recently I didn't even know. Anyway, so when you look at that Roman letter A, what does it tell you? Well, I know, I remember from being in Rome and looking at things, that the letter A is the formal A that we know today as a capital A, because it was the form of an A that was put on the inscriptions on stone, marble, and so on, carved into the stone. And the idea that it is only using straight lines and that they're like symmetrical and so on is because that was the easiest way to carve it into the stone. So the way that the letter A became the letter A we have today came through all 5 of those steps, finally to become a letter on monuments and so on in Roman times. Now, if you look at the map, you can see that it moves from 4 to 5, and now it makes sense. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. It moves around on the land. Okay. Hopefully you haven't been reading a lot of the words on these drawings, that you've been just being a little kid, having a little kid's mind, like looking at a picture book and just following the history of the letter A. So, finally, we have the last drawing, which is really a composite of those 5 drawings. And now I want you to try an experiment. Look at the drawing. The map will be the same, but look at the drawing. And notice that they're all 5 there at once. Now, if you look at that drawing and imagine that was what I gave you from the beginning, and all I did was talk about moving between pictures, can you imagine how much more difficult it would be to have limited what you look at to the changes? Now, hopefully, because you have seen the history, you've been given the young child's picture book version of the history of the letter A, it will make sense, because truthfully, you can now choose to look at that, all 5 of those, but you can choose to look at the first 2, or you can look at the second and third, or you can look at the third and the fourth. This is a skill to limit what you look at in a drawing to 2 things that are in some way related, and to contrast and compare them, and that's the essence of this kind of visual learning. Seeing change, visualizing change. Okay, so it's not looking at a photograph and memorizing the photograph, which is not change. It's stillness. But in this story, this visual story, you are visualizing change. Now, some of those changes we didn't look at because we didn't skip any steps. But imagine that you look at number one, which is a drawing that represents a real life object. And then you look at number five, which is a monument symbol that represents a sound. Ah. That's it. It does not represent a real life object. It represents the sound ah. That's it. And look at the steps in between. So now consider all those steps. That is a lot. That is a lot. So now I want you to think about some of the things that I said at the beginning. How many of these things are symbols? Definitely the 2 through 5. 4 is a drawing, even if it's a poorly primitive drawing. It's still a drawing. It's not a symbol, really. It still has a direct connection to the object in the real world that it represents. And then the second one, it has become a symbol, but it has become a symbol of the drawing of the real life object. It does not at this point represent a sound. That's not there yet. And it's not until the third step that it becomes a symbol that's connected to a sound, and it divorces itself from any real life object, because that letter A can be in any word for all manner of real life things. That's a huge leap. Huge. And then in the fourth step there, the Etruscans do what cultures do, and over time there's some variation just because people stylize things. It's boring to do the same thing over and over, and in this drawing there's some stylized version of the Greek version. And then finally, function, meaning being the most efficient way to carve a letter into stone, dictates that the letter now becomes a sound that is read on a monument. Okay. Symbols, position, now that's there, shapes and lines, and each of these things has its own connection to meanings. If you don't remember what I just said, don't go back, don't write notes, don't try and memorize it, because none of that is going to help. I am not going to test you on any of this. I just want you to reclaim that ability to learn, that incredible ability that you had when you were 1 and 2 and 3 years old, where you learned from comparing pictures, and slowly over time you developed what I call a visual dictionary. And we'll talk more about that in the next 2 talks. For now, goodbye from Alpha Beta Land. I hope it hasn't been too confusing, and hopefully I've reawakened your interest, like, where did the letter B come from? Not today. Another story for another day, and another visual story. Anyway, as always, I'm glad you're with me, and I wish you well.